Hello, everyone, and welcome back to WABAN, the movie and TV show podcast where an expert on the subject discusses things with the average viewer. I am your host, Nim, and I am joined here today by the linguist professor, Louise Banks.
I don't know why this always gets me every time, but you just hesitating on your own name instead of whoever character you picked for me.
I'm like, what's my name? Am I the same thing every time, Nim, and it's not that hard to say, but I'm Neem.
Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. But anyways, so
I'm just realizing how hard it is to do something like that for like an actual, like, pretty much human character, like with no like outstanding qualities besides like not outstanding qualities, but like cartoonishly outstanding qualities.
It's true. It's true. Well, yeah, because if I do a character like, like the Joker, you can just do a funny Joker voice,
Mm-hmm.
But if it's like Louise Banks, professor, I mean, I guess you could just say something about language and something like
I'm trying to think of like
smart statement about language.
Said,
but anyways, so we watched Arrival. First time both of us have seen it. It's a movie I've been meaning to see for a long time now, and I just haven't. I actually have owned it on DVD for a long time and just never got around to watching it. Because it's directed by Denis Villeneuve, the same director who directed Blade Runner 2049, which we already talked about on this podcast. And this was the year before Blade Runner 2049, I believe. And yeah, I think all I knew about this movie was the basic premise of like aliens land, we struggle to communicate, so we hire somebody who's like an expert at language to help. And then I knew there was like some big twists in it and stuff, but I didn't know anything beyond that. So what are your thoughts?
I haven't even heard of it before this, but I am very glad that I watched it. It's really good. I don't know, with the whole military presence, which makes sense, it almost feels like it would eventually become an action movie, but it never does. And like, maybe the way that it has tension like that, which really works for it.
Yeah, because it's like you never know what the aliens are really doing, what their goals are. I mean, that's the whole point of the movie, is for them to ask the question, why are you here? But yeah, and they just kind of sit there. They aren't attacking. Mm-hmm. They're just sitting there waiting to be communicated with. And there's actually a good amount of hinting towards it and build up to it, to where when you find out the true nature of why they're there and what it, everything kind of comes together, and you really get like the full picture of everything, it really comes together in an interesting way that makes everything make sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the most, I'm just going to say, I know it's obvious that these are spoiler filled, because they're hour-long podcasts about one singular movie. But spoilers for this movie from here on out. It's very good. You should watch it. But yeah, no. So it's very interesting that the movie opens with showing essentially the entire life of her daughter, Hannah,
Mm-hmm.
right? It shows when she's born. It just, goes through it all until she dies. It's really sad way to open your movie. Really
Mm-hmm.
gut-punching way to open your movie. Like, oh, I just watched this person as a cute little kid and now they're dying. Okay, great. But you and then the movie plays out in a way where you actually kind of think that that happened before the movie.
Right, yeah.
But you find out that it hasn't happened yet. And the movie does a really good job, I think, of not really making that obvious, because she never directly talks about it to other characters because it hasn't happened yet, right? She's not going to be like, oh yeah, in the past, I used to be married, and I had a daughter and she died, but there's like little details, like, I don't know, it was like at the beginning when she first goes home, and after the sighting of the aliens has come after they not landed, but they're floating, but after they've arrived. I guess that's why it's called that. Oh, that's why they call it that. She goes to she's on the phone with her mother, and she has a line like, oh, I'm the same, or like it's something that made it sound like her mother asked her, like, oh, how are you doing? And it kind of, how are you holding up, or like that type, whatever she said, it made it sound like her mother asked something like that, which when I was watching it, I was thinking, oh, maybe it's in reference to, like, it's still been recent that her daughter died, and she's asking her how she's doing about that. I was kind of thinking that that's what it was, because again, I didn't yet know that was technically the future. But it's also like, yeah, so there's like interesting little things like that where it just kind of like, and then every time they had those cuts to her and her daughter throughout the movie, I just assumed they were flashbacks, because that's a normal thing that movies will do. They'll have flashbacks that relate to what's happening right now, or like something reminds them of something that happened in the past. So I was like, oh yeah, they're just flashbacks, okay, but they're not. They're flash forwards. Really weird. And like, because like, I mean, throughout the movie, every time she has those like flashbacks, you do also notice that she kind of seems a little confused by them. When you like looking back on it, that makes more sense now, because it's like, if she's having a flashback of something that already happened, she's not going to necessarily be confused by it, because it's happened in her past. It's like, oh yeah, I'm remembering this thing that happened. But she's she's just kind of, but because it's the future, she's like, it's taken aback. Very interesting.
Yeah, you go through that whole movie just thinking that she's flashing back, and then I just remember the one where the daughter comes downstairs and asks her, like, what a word is. Like, what's the word for something? It's like, no, it's more sciencey than that. And she goes,
ask your father.
Science, ask your father. Yeah,
and then you're like, wait, is her father the scientist guy in this movie? Yeah.
Well, my brain's like, oh, did she like also first marry a scientist? But that's like an odd coincidence.
That like, yeah, she used to be with a scientist, and now she's like kind of maybe starting a thing with a scientist now. Like that's the same type of thing, yeah.
And then later on, it like the answer gets brought up, and the scientist dude says, non-zero sum game.
Yeah.
And then she flashes forward, we assume back, and and remembers it and tells her daughter. And it's like a weird correlation, like, oh yeah, they both, like, she knows the answer because he said it.
Yeah, it's really interesting how they do that. And obviously the big climax of the movie is her knowing what to say to the guy, knowing who she has to call, and exactly what she has to say, because he says it back to her in the future, and she sees her own future knowing. So it gets a little like weird with that kind of stuff, but
I mean, it's closed loop stuff.
Yeah, but like also it's supposed to be very confusing, because the idea is that it's a form of looking at the world that we can't comprehend because of our language. It's all about how the movie's all about how your language helps you to interpret the world around you, how your language is formed. Our human languages are very linear. They're very much, you start from this side, you start on the left side of the page, you follow it down to the right side. It takes time to read, a certain amount of time to read from this to this. Whereas the aliens have a very non-linear form of communication, which is just these symbols that can essentially have an entire sentence in one little symbol.
Right.
So it's like, because their way of communicating is so different, it allows them the ability to not only see language in a non-linear way, but also see the rest of life in that way, including like time. And as the movie progresses, her ability to kind of see time in this non-linear way of like seeing the future and seeing different points here and there really only starts to happen once she starts to learn the language.
Right.
That's what helps her unlock that sort of, I guess, ability, right? Is she starts studying the language, and then occasionally she starts getting these weird flashbacks that are actually flash forwards, doesn't know what it means, but then,
I just remember when they first discover that they have a written form of language, or written, and they're like describing it and like how it's like this circular thing with like the various outcroppings and curls and whatnot mean everything about it. But they're describing how certain details of it can mean certain words, and how they interconnect can display how each word is related to each other, and how it takes up the same amount of space for every single sentence and every single symbol. And the thing that really stuck with me was, in order to write like this, you could only, like, one, use one hand, and two, you would have to know all the words that you wanted to use and know it from beginning to end already.
Yeah, which, like, seems very insane to us, because that's not how our language works. But it's like, in a way, it's like they, when you're taught a language from birth, and that's just your natural language that you grow up with, that everyone around you has, like these aliens, their language, they all grew up with it like this. It's very easy and natural to them, Yeah, I think this is a very interesting movie, like, to really get into like the idea of like how just language is formed, and how, I don't know, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it feels like I don't know if the director came up with the idea of the movie, or whoever came up with the idea.
It was based on a book, I'm pretty sure. I forget the title of the book, but it's based on a book, yeah.
But it feels like they just found this like weird coincidental correlation between how we've like write out sentences, starting from one end, figuring it out as we go along, and then ending it, to how we view time, because it's the same way.
Right.
And then
yeah,
they're
it's
like, oh, what if that's why we viewed it time like that? So they created this to show like, oh, there's this alien species that has their language, just singular symbols that mean an entire sentence, and they always, they write it out with the same amount of time each time, no matter how big the sentence is, and they have to know it forward and backward, beginning to end, to be able to write it. And so they view time like that as well.
Yeah, it's really, it's interesting. It's like, because I mean, the whole idea is that like whatever language you speak, that's how you interpret the worlds. That's how you think. That's how you dream. When you think, you're thinking in you, and I think in English because that's the language we know. I've heard of people who go and they try to learn second languages, and when they learn it really well, they'll sometimes occasionally think in that language, and it's weird because they get to know the language so well, and it's that's, you don't really think about it that way very much, like how when you think you almost are, thinking in a language. Like it's almost like you need a form of language in order to think very complex thoughts, at least.
Yeah. They even mentioned, I forget what they call it, but there's some theory that actually happens, that your language affects how you think, and that directly reference it in the movie. But
yeah.
You talking about it just now just reminded me, apparently there's some people that don't think in their language. They have to put it into words as they're trying to say it, or at least for some things.
Yeah.
I always found that very weird.
That is very strange because, I don't know. I know for a fact, when I think, in the English language. Sometimes I talk out loud when I'm by myself, when I'm thinking.
We're not crazy.
Just talk to myself, yeah. But yeah, I thought that was very interesting. And this was an interesting point I saw. So I was watching videos about this movie after I watched it, because that's what I do when I watch movies. I watch YouTube videos about them. And somebody was talking about, so this is kind of a fun little detail. So the scientist, who I cannot remember his name at the moment, Ian Donnelly, there you go, that's the character's name, played by Jeremy Renner, played by Hawkeye. He's they're thinking of what do we call them, and he's like, I'm thinking Abbott and Costello. Now, you know who they are?
I know that they're where are they from? They're from some sort of mythology. Maybe it's the biblical.
No. I mean, maybe, but no.
They're philosophers?
No. They're classic. They're old school comedians from along, I want to say the 30s, 40s, somewhere in there. I mean, maybe there's some other history of those names. I don't know. But so their most famous comedy sketch that they ever did, their most well-known one, is about these guys who are they're gonna play a baseball game, and the one guy's talking about who's on what positions, and he's like, who's on first, but the guy's name, the names of the people are who, and stuff like that. So he's like, who's on first, and he's like, no, who's on second, no, who's and there's other, it goes on for a while. Yeah. So what people are saying is the reason they went with those names is because their most famous, Abbott and Costello's most famous sketches about miscommunication and about the difficulties of communicating in language and stuff, and that's kind of what the movie's about. So it's
that's fun.
I didn't even really think about that until they pointed that out in this video, and I was like, oh yeah, that's right, because I mean, I've seen that comedy sketch. I've seen that before. It's a classic.
I think I've at least listened to it a few times.
Yeah. But yeah, I just thought that was a fun little detail. But yeah, beyond that, I think the movie did a really good job. So this is a very definitely a very slow-paced movie, right?
Oh yeah.
Which I think for some people would probably not, I know some people don't like that. But for me, I think it did a really good job at slowly building the tension. Especially the first time they get there and they go into the alien ship and see the aliens. That whole scene, it took a while, but that it was very like the way it was shot and edited and everything, it just very much built the tension. And it did a good job at really showing you not only like how terrifying it all was, how it all looked, but also how terrifying it is to the people. Like you could see her face, you can constantly hear her like heavy breathing in that, that suit that she had on, the hazmat suit thing. It's like it's and then just like the very weird way it works as well. Like they go up in the hole, but then all of a sudden the gravity shifts and it's like, oh, how does this work? We don't know. This is some alien thing, alien craft. We don't even know what substance it's made out of. Yeah. And every time they were walking down the tunnel, they would show it from a different angle, like upside down one time. They showed it from the side, like a sideways angle one time, and I think they did that to like give off the sense of like, yeah, they're walking in a weird way that's not like, to give off the feeling of like, oh yeah, the gravity shifted to different different area. It's like weird. It's really cool. And then like they walk up to the end of it and it looks at first like it's just a straight hole that goes through the whole thing out the top, because it looks like the sky on the other side. But then the color shifts and there's like smoke everywhere, and it turns out it's like these aliens behind this like glass like thing. It was just the way all of that was put together was so great, like so amazing. I really loved that. Just like, because I mean, it did a good job of building everything up. And
I keep wondering what the bird was for, because it was a nice effect with its tweeting constantly there, and like you'd sometimes hear it in the background when you shouldn't.
Yeah, I was trying to figure that out as well. Like, were they trying to kind of see what they would react to it, or like, yeah, they every time they went in, they brought a bird in a little cage in to talk to the aliens with, and I still haven't been able to. I was trying to figure out why they did that. Yeah, that is interesting. I don't actually know. But yeah. And then it was also, I think it's also an interesting story about sort of humanity and sort of how do humans react to things like this, and how you have different countries reacting in different ways very interestingly, and and just kind of the human cooperation. How well would humans cooperate in a situation like this? They got that one message and they kind of figured out, oh, it's part of a 12-part message. We have to combine all 12 of them. We need help from the other places. They probably got one too, but they aren't cooperating, so they're not going to do that. It's like, even though like,
right. I mean, there's a constant like. Obviously, there's the conflict of trying to communicate with these heptapods, as they end up calling them, but there's also like the Colonel, whether or not he'll let them try to teach them the language or give them the resources that they need to be able to communicate with them.
It's like he doesn't particularly. He's like doesn't understand her method of doing it, and she has to explain sometimes, and he's just like, what? Even though like I'm thinking about it and I'm like, she's the language expert here, like just go with it, like.
And then there's like the higher ups that the Colonel is answering to, or whatever his board is, that he's constantly saying like, their first and last question will always be, how can this be used against us? They're working against them to like try to communicate with these things, and effectively, without being interrupted by like bureaucratic tape. And then the conflict between the different locations, and the information sharing that stops being shared and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And like also like the different interpretations of the same message. Because they sent out the message that had the word weapon in it. It was like why are you here? And it was like the one said they interpreted it as offer weapon, I think.
Yeah, something along those lines.
But then the one in China, they interpreted it as like use weapon, which they took as a threat, as like. But then there was also the whole debate over, when they say weapon, do they really mean weapon or do they mean like tool? They're just because that's another thing when it comes to language, is there's never always, and that's something you learn whenever you learn a different language, is there's not always a perfect one-to-one easy translation of everything.
You're right.
Like some languages have words for things that our language doesn't, or we have words for things that other languages don't because they describe it in a different way, or like you have to think about like, just because we interpreted it as use weapon doesn't automatically mean they're ready to attack us, let's attack them right now. I don't know.
There's also I really like the moment when she figures out that the Chinese or somebody was using a game to communicate with them. And she immediately points out, like, okay, if I communicate with you with a game, what are the 3 possibilities in that game? Defeat, conflict, and victory. Or whatever words that she used to describe it. Which, when phrased like that, is immediately problematic.
Yeah, when you're like, those are the only... Because at that point, those are the only frames of reference they have for that language, is those specific... They think of that... They start thinking of the language in that frame of mind instead of the way the language actually is, yeah. Right, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to see the different methods that people kind of go with and the different ideas of how they... Because, I mean, that is a very, very valid point to think about, even like in a realistic scenario. If something like this happens, aliens come to Earth, is, how would we communicate with them? How would we learn the language? Because, I mean, there's so many like movies and stuff, like, even like cartoons, stuff like that, where like aliens just kind of come and they're already speaking our language, and it's like, okay, it's fine, and it works for that story because they don't care about the language side of things, because that would just kind of slow down the storytelling and wouldn't, it makes the storytelling easier for stories like that. But in a realistic sense, like, obviously aliens would definitely not speak the same language as us in the real world. Like our Earth, just our singular planet, has how many different languages? Like, there's no way, like,
hundreds.
There's no way some alien species would just speak the same language. Yeah. So that is a very interesting point. Like, how would you go about interpreting this? Because, I mean, they brought her on, and my first thought, and they're like, well, you helped us, with the insurgents at wherever this one time, with their interpreting their stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, that's a much easier thing to do, because that's a language that she already either knows somewhat, or at least has a basis, or can do some research on, that's already been done about like how to translate. There's already like, precedence for her to be able to find stuff out about that language, or like know the language. But in this scenario, it's 100% blind. There's no, there's no precedence for it. Like the first thing they do is record the sounds they're making, and are like, this must be their language. What do you make of this? Okay, like...
I mean, it's the kind of thing of like, even though she's an expert, they play back those sounds and she's like, okay, this is just noise.
Right. It doesn't matter how much of an expert she is. To her, this is just noise because it's not anything like any language she's ever heard or knows anything about.
And who knows if they're hearing the intended like meaning in it, like the intended part that contains meaning. Like that, the sound itself could just be a byproduct of how they actually talk. They could not even have anything capable of hearing the same way that we do.
Right. It could just be just the sound they make, you know? Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's very interesting to think about that. And then because that was like the first big breakthrough in their discovery was, oh, they have the visual language that they were giving out to them. And then eventually them discovering that visual language does not correlate to any sounds in the way our language does, like at all. So then you realize, oh, their whole approach of record what the sound they're making and go off of that was completely wrong from the beginning. Obviously, it makes sense because, again, from our point of view, language is spoken. You can hear language. Oh, they're making sounds. It's probably their language. Let's figure this out from that. But, that's just because that's the way humans are and the way humans think.
And when dealing with an alien beyond your understanding and that doesn't follow the same, barely even follows the same set of physics, you don't want to look at it from a human perspective. You can't see it from a human point of view because it won't line up.
Yeah, it's possible that they have the similar type style of language, spoken language, but there's no way of knowing that. You can't assume that that's the case. And I think that's where hiring a professional linguist like her, who's very smart and knows a lot about language, was very helpful for them because they were so narrow-minded with it of it's got to be like this. But she seemed a lot more open-minded about language and about the possibilities of language. And so she was more willing to kind of explore these other possibilities that eventually led them to the actual proper answers to it,
Right. She was immediately like, okay, I don't see us getting anywhere with a verbal thing. Let's try written.
Well, it was easier. Yeah, because they were trying, and then they saw them create those symbols, and then she was like, "Oh, wait, that's probably what we should be focusing on." Yeah.
I always really like when any media gets into communication difficulties between aliens, because there's Marvel with Groot, where it's just "I am Groot," and it's just different ways of him saying that, but it's actually there's very subtle differences in the way that he says it that you can get meaning out of, and that's how some people can understand him.
Yeah, it's just weird stuff like that.
There's also in the Mass Effect series, video game series that I absolutely adore, I forget what the alien is called, but there's these big lumbering four-legged creatures that they can speak, but they can't articulate emotion in their speech patterns, and they don't have the same facial structure to display those either. Because all their emotions are displayed through pheromones to their own kind, but most people can't sense them or smell them at all, so it's wasted. So what they do is they're just surprised, and I love
they'll
it
just
so
say
much.
the emotion they're feeling,
just for the benefit of all
because they know that those people can't understand their emotion.
Right.
Yeah,
I love it so much. It's so fun.
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah. Now that I'm thinking about it, I was actually I think I was thinking this when I was watching it too. I was so they're so focused on the idea of it being a spoken language until they realize it's completely visual. And I'm realistically, we do have a precedence for visual language in the real world. We have sign language. right? For
Yeah,
people
yeah.
who are deaf, right? So it's like realistically, you know, it make kind of, I thought that was, I don't know, it just made me think of that, you know, and then there are many different sign languages depending on different, you know, countries and stuff. There's American Sign Language, there's like, you know, ones from other countries as well, different ones, but yeah, no, it's like we already have actually a precedence for a completely visual language on Earth. But you know, of course, they weren't going to get anybody who's an expert on visual languages to come in.
I mean,
well, she's an expert on languages in general, I guess.
Right. And
but
I don't know. I mean, on one hand, you do have a point. However, like, obviously, written language is purely visual, and sign language is also based off of, like, one, what language you're speaking, and two, even the area.
Well,
because there's like American Sign Language, there's British Sign Language.
So it's not really based on a language that you're already speaking. It is actually a completely separate language. But yeah,
is it really? Because like,
yeah,
because like American Sign Language, you know, like you have the English alphabet, and
well, they have the
like
same
all the words,
right. You would use
words.
they use the same. Like if you speak American Sign Language, you're going to use the same alphabet and everything in the same words, but like sentence structure is different. A lot. It's just very very different. There's not like an exact translation for each word. There's it's I mean it's a different, it's basically a completely different language. It's just might use the same written language, but not, you know, the actual spoken language is pretty much a different language. I mean, it is a different language.
I know a little bit about sign language, but not enough to know if you're right or not, and it's bugging me.
So the only reason I really know much about it is because my girlfriend is going to college for deaf education, so she's learning some sign language. And her roommate and friend and best friend, our friend, she's actually going to college for interpreting, deaf interpreting, ASL interpreting. So I learn a lot about it, how it works and stuff. Even though I don't know it really at all, but I don't really know it at all. But like, I mean, I've learned some stuff from them.
Right. I learned a few of sign language from friends on VR chat who just like, oh, you can use sign language at VR, that's fun. And so they learn it and they do stuff. I'm just like, oh, I know what that one means, I got it.
Yeah, so you just like learn occasional vocabulary words. Yeah,
right.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting just how, you know, just how different languages can be and how differently you can think because of it. And again, I think this movie does a very good job at like explaining that, you know. Like, I mean, think about, because I mean, again, so many of us are so caught up on the idea of language is spoken, language is a spoken thing, language, that's not really true. Clearly, you know, I mean, there are people who, again, there's like sign language, there's, you know, in this movie there's visual language, but what if there could be a language that is all about other senses, like your sense of touch, for instance, which there actually is a precedence for that too. There's a thing called tactile sign, which is essentially you do signs it's for people who are deaf and blind. And it's like you do signs. I mean, I don't really know like barely anything about it, but you basically make signs and like hand shapes in somebody else's hand and they kind of feel it.
Oh,
So it's like
okay.
a language 100% based on touch.
And then there
a
is,
sense of touch,
course, Braille.
Yeah. Although that's not necessarily as much of a language. That's an alphabet.
I suppose so, yes.
More than, because like, I mean, if you're blind, you're going to speak the same language. You're just going to use Braille as you use a different alphabet, which is Braille. But so that's a bit different. But yeah, it is. I think language is pretty interesting. How like, I don't know how more expansive it can be than just a simple narrow-minded kind of way of looking at it. And interestingly enough too, we do have even people whose primary language is a spoken language. There is elements of language that are visual, that are probably use the sense of touch, this different other senses too. Like visually, you might gesture, you might, and people know what you mean, you
Body
shake your head.
language,
Yes. Yeah. Right. Even, there's elements of that. Or like, maybe like, again, like I said, using the sense of touch, like you tap somebody on the shoulder. Okay, that's them trying to get your attention. Like there's, in a way, that's communicating something. So it is technically kind of language, a part of the language. So it's like, in a way, everybody does use these other little bits and pieces of like language, of a visual language, of like a language with the sense of touch, despite the fact that our main piece of language, our main complex set of language is the is visual, or not visual, auditory, right. Talking, spoken.
Yeah, I mean, basically everything, or if not literally everything that we do, can convey meaning. So,
which is essentially what communicating is, and is in a way what a form of language in a way. It's really interesting to like kind of think about like how we communicate, I guess, and how it develops, and also like how you can learn a language that you have no precedence for. Because you think about it, if I want to learn another language, like I want to learn French, okay, there's already textbooks on how to learn French for an English-speaking person to learn French. There's already so many people who've studied it, so many people who speak both languages who can help you out. There's already there's so much out there to help you out with it. But you think about like back far enough in history, how did that come about? How did, let's say like a colonizer come and see like somebody from another country that spoke a completely different language. How did they eventually find a way to communicate or learn? I mean, I know in a lot of cases they didn't communicate. They just, fought and killed them. But, that's, but like, there are situations where like they've been, people who are from completely different places have completely different languages that don't even have, any similarity to each other, right? Like have been able to learn how to speak that language. Like how did people in the more the like English and stuff, the romantic languages like English, French, all that, how did they learn how to speak like Chinese, for instance? That's a very different language, completely different alphabet, completely different, very different, like how did that happen? Because to me it's like, how do you learn a language if you have no way to know it? And it's interesting. I think this movie explores that a little bit, but with the idea of like aliens. Aliens come. How do we learn their language? How would you, despite there's no precedent for it, there's no. That's something that always fascinated me. Like, how did we get to a point in history like where people were able to learn languages that they had no possible precedents for, you know.
I
It's just
it's an
interesting.
interesting question. Yeah.
It interests me, and I know there's probably a lot of studies on that and out there and stuff, but it's just always something that I've thought about. I would think about it and be like, how do you like? Because from my point of view, my brain, I'm not great with like language and learning and stuff, so I'd be like, you know, how do you even do that? I struggle to learn a language even with all the help.
I feel like with the way that the world developed, because like, you know, civilization started at a point and then spread from there. I feel like there might have been like in between grounds where like, oh, this language is starting to develop off of this original one, and it starts branching out, and there will still constantly be people like in between the two branches that
who
are
have learned know both. Yeah.
So that there'll be that, and even if there isn't anything like that, it'd be less like of like translating and more like they're doing in this movie, figuring out, like deciphering, I think is the right word.
Yeah, and then slowly over time you figure it out, and then although I do think her ability to learn the language was like actually learn the language was a little quicker than would be realistic, maybe, because by the end of the movie she was able to well, right, but like by the end of the movie she was pretty much able to fully understand what they're saying without even having like any charts or any her like her research to be like, okay, let me look at that symbol, what does that symbol mean, let's see, based on my no, like I feel like that was a little bit like, okay, like I'm like, how long did this movie take place, and she's already like fully able to just speak the language, and they're able to understand our language already because they could understand what she was saying too. Although they might have, I don't know. Yeah, it's just I just thought that was already
weird. Well, you would think they would already know since they've experienced the future already, but who knows? Whatever.
Yeah,
it's confusing.
It is confusing.
Like I've heard of like once you learn a second language and a third and a fourth, it just gets easier and easier because like your brain gets rewired to be able to take in that information now, and like, oh yeah, I have all these words that mean this thing.
That's true, because like we don't really know how many languages the character actually knows because it never
just
says,
because like
that it's a lot, right? Which is why she's like the expert in, you know, that the one person, like out of all the linguist professors in America, she's the one that they go to, right? So that could be the case, is that she's already learned so many languages that she's just good at learning languages quickly. Yeah. Even if it's a language that's so much different than any language she's learned, like just completely
right.
Yeah.
You were talking about like people, like meeting people of other cultures and civilizations and not having a reference for their language. And she like she lies and makes up an example of like kangaroo saying, "I don't know what you're saying."
Oh yeah, that I like that.
But yeah, that was great. She's
like, yep, they came in the Aborigines. He said, "What is that?" And they said, "Kangaroo." Turns out that kangaroo actually means "I don't know what you're saying," or
I don't understand.
That's a good story. But I made it up. Yeah.
I do also. I don't know if.
But it makes her point, though. It makes her point.
Yeah,
it's like
it does.
It's you know, you ask a question, they say something like, "Oh, that must be them answering the question." Oh, how do you know? You don't know the language. She's very thoughtful and careful about every little detail. She's like, we can't jump to a conclusion about an interpretation and be like, "Oh, this is what they meant by this." Okay, we know. She's like, we have to take time. Like the weapon thing. Like, oh, they weapon. Oh, they're threatening us. We better be ready to attack. No, wait. what, are we sure that we know what they meant by that?
Mm-hmm.
Let's not jump to conclusions, right? It's like, let's take our time to get it right. And that's what she said in the beginning. She's like, we got to be very careful to get every detail right in the early stages of learning this language. Because if you mess up the early stages, you're going to completely run into way more issues later on when you get more complex stuff.
But it just reminded me, I don't know if this is a true thing or not, because I found it on the internet, but apparently, and I don't remember any specifics of this, but like, probably when English colonizers came to like Scotland or something, they would like point at a river and ask, what's this called? Ask for the name of the river. And they would always just answer with like the Scottish word for river. So now, like, basically every river in that area is named the same thing.
Which is just the word for river.
Right.
It's the river. Yeah.
Like the Sahara Desert.
Right. What does that just mean? Desert?
Yeah, it just means desert.
Sahara just means desert. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually funny.
But she does a really good job of like pointing out these caveats that like, you need to be careful of this. This is how we can fuck up. We can't do that.
Like little things that most people wouldn't think about, but because she's such an expert, like, because it's, I mean, you know, which is like, that's why they hired her, right? But even though sometimes they're like, oh, I don't like your way of doing this. And you're like, she's the expert, you dummies. Like,
you may not
she's
like
the language expert,
right.
But she's the, I'm sorry, like, right. If I get medical information from my doctor, you know, I'm gonna trust him over what I thought it was. Oh, I thought it was probably this. Oh, my doctor said it was actually this. Like, oh, nah, he must be wrong. Come on. Even though I'm like, I'm not an expert. He's the expert. He's the one who went to a bunch of schooling.
A really good example of this. Many become one is how they interpret what they said. And like all the military guys are just like, they're trying to dwindle our numbers down. They're trying to kill us all down to just one. They want us all to kill each other until there's only one left standing. And she's just like, that could mean some assembly required to them. Calm your asses. Yeah,
exactly. That's right. Exactly. That's the thing. It all depends on like how you interpret the word. Because again, maybe they, in their language, they have only one word that means both for weapon and tool. Maybe they don't have separate words for that. Maybe that's the same thing to them. So, you know, to them, you've used the word they've learned what, you know, so you interpreted one of their words as, oh, this means weapon to them. And then but to them, they're thinking, oh, this is tool weapon. It's the same thing. They're not thinking it like that. They're just thinking of it, you know, the way they think of it as it is the same thing. And it's like, yeah. So, I mean, exactly. That's the thing you have to think about with language is like some languages, it's weird to think about, but some languages, there's not a separate word for like something that seems so obvious in our language. Like, oh, why wouldn't you have a word for that? You know? Why wouldn't you have a word for that? It's stuff like that. You know, like a lot of ancient languages didn't even have a word for the color blue. And so blue would have just been seen as like black or, you know, not blue, like other, you know, blue wasn't a defined color. So,
that's because it doesn't occur in nature like ever besides the sky, right?
Yeah, or like blueberries or something. But like, true. You know, even like blueberries or like berries, they're probably dark enough that they would just call them black, you know? But yeah, that's you know, it's like things like that seem so obvious to us now. Like you see, yeah. Or like, it is actually interesting how just having a separate word for something can rethink how you think of something, how you see something. The color brown is basically, it's dark orange, essentially.
I suppose.
it legitimately is. But at one point it was classified as a separate color and given a separate word, so we see it as a separate color, like it's so obviously a different color to us. But before that was a thing in, you know, other languages or other societies, whatever, they would have just seen that and been like, yeah, that's orange. Just simply adding a new word to the language can reshape how you visualize things too. Like,
I'm thinking about how brown is a dark orange. Like I'm colorblind, so like.
Oh, okay. Well, that probably makes it even harder for you.
It's red green colorblind, so perhaps. But like I've always I look for brown on like a color wheel when I'm like in character creators or something, and I could never get it. Never. It always come out like red or green. I'm just like, now you say that it's a dark orange. Maybe I'll
just switch to the orange side and make it darker.
Yeah, maybe it'll be easy from now on, because I just never realized that.
Yeah. Well, it's like things like that, or like pink is light red.
Right.
You know,
that one I get.
That one that one's easier to get. Well, right, because if you mix red with white, you typically get pink. You know. Well, I mean, you know, I think that's easy for you to get because you make cotton candy, and you know, the powder that you put in for pink cotton candy is red, but then it comes out, it mixes with the white sugar and comes out pink cotton candy, right? So you understand that one very well.
Yeah, I've been covered in it before, so
if it's interesting because that's another one where if we didn't have a separate word for the color pink as like classified as a separate color, we would probably just look at it and be like, that's like a lighter red color. That's red, you know, but just like a lighter red color. Yeah. Because like some colors don't have that, where like, don't have like a separate, like we don't have a separate name for light blue. It's just like, that's sky blue or whatever, or like dark blue, you know.
Right.
So we see it and we're like, yeah, that's blue, you know.
Now I'm just thinking about like purple and violet, and I'm just like, what is the difference?
I don't know if there's a difference between purple and violet. I mean, it's the same thing. It's yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's technically a difference, but it's not that I know of. But yeah, so yeah, it's even down to the small details. Language can really affect how you think of the things, how you see the world, how you visualize the world and everything around you, how you interpret everything. And that's what this movie is all about. How the way your language is a huge part of how. Now, if there was a language that existed like the language in this movie, would that you learning that language automatically make you see time in that way? I mean, I guess there's no way of knowing for sure. I doubt it. Seems like, I mean, but it's a movie, so it's, you know, it's a science fiction movie, so it's like, yeah. It gets the point across. It gets the themes and the story of what the story's getting across. So like, and it's really interesting, especially when you piece everything together of like the flashbacks that were really flash forwards and why she named her daughter Hannah.
Same
because it's the same forward and backward. Which makes so much sense when you watch the movie. You're like, oh, of course she would give her kid's name make it a palindrome. Yeah. And then it also just makes it so much harder to watch too when you get to that end part. Like, not harder to watch, but like it's so much sadder. Just like she knows her daughter's gonna die and like when it's gonna happen.
Yup.
And she has that conversation with it, and like that's why her husband left her, because she told him that or something, and he didn't. I don't know, or that's part of what broke down their marriage, I guess. And you're just kind of like, because at first it seems like kind of like a happy ending, like, oh, she's together with him, and they're like, hey, let's make a baby, and I'm like, yeah, and then I'm like, oh, is this a happy ending now? Wait, because they're going to get a divorce. Their daughter's going to die, like, at a young age. So, is this a happy ending?
It's
Yeah.
and she's even doing this little monologue of like, oh yeah, I know what's to come, but I embrace it. It's like, what?
But it's that kind of raises the question. And she says, like, if you could, she asks him, she's like, if you could see your entire future, would you change things? And I'm like, it's like in that moment, she's thinking about it, like, should I change things? Like,
right?
should I even let this happen?
And like, can she though? Like,
right, yeah. Or is it just bound to happen? Even though she can see the future, is it just bound to happen?
And
no
it's
matter
not
what?
like she just sees one moment in the future. She can see her entire life timeline.
Yeah.
So she knows exactly what things that she does in each scenario. And she could consciously make the decision to do something else.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's weird.
Because like sometimes when characters can see the future, they're like, oh, this is the result. I'm going to make my actions resist the result. But because they didn't see what actions they took in the first place, they end up doing exactly what got them that result anyway. She doesn't have that problem.
Because she can see any point. But is she able to see any point whenever she wants, or is it just kind of like she can... Because I was trying to figure out, like, how... Can she only see certain moments and at certain times, if they're like... I don't know.
I mean, the whole concept to me seems like you need to know the entirety of the scenario, the event, her life in this case. It's like forward and backward every single moment continuously. The same way
like
that
at
they
all
do
times.
Their written language.
Yeah. Like you see every moment of your life at all times almost.
Mm-hmm.
Which that would almost make life hard to live, I feel like. I mean, maybe, I guess unless you like fully embrace it the way she does. Or like maybe it's like you have a deeper understanding of it. But like to me, I think about it and I'm like, oh, like knowing exactly what's going to happen with all the time, knowing everything of my entire life at every moment would almost make it hard to just enjoy life, I guess. I don't know, be in the moment. I don't know.
It's a difficult thing to think about because is it just like she remembers every moment of her life forward and back, and then she's experiencing the moment that she's actually in? Or is it more like she is experiencing every single moment of her life all at once?
Yeah. In
which case, she's already experiencing her daughter's death and her birth and everything in between all at once. So it's just like, okay, what?
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the whole point of it is like, it's supposed to make you kind of be like, wait, how does that even... Because, I mean, yeah, like, we can't comprehend it because the whole point is like, oh, we can't comprehend it because our way of thinking doesn't allow for something like this to... Yeah. It's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm definitely glad I saw the movie. I'm glad I never had it spoiled for me.
Oh, yeah.
Because it was definitely a movie that's better when you don't know really anything other than, I mean, if you know, like, the basic plot of, like, oh, aliens come down, they're trying to communicate with them, like, that's fine. But, like, to know the result of everything is, it's nicer to, like, not. And then get your mind blown as you're watching it. Yeah, so that was Arrival. I don't know. I don't have much more to say about it. Do you?
I'm all good. Really good movie.
All right. Yeah, very good movie. So that was Arrival. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this week's episode of WABAN. You can listen to a new episode of WABAN every single Saturday at noon Eastern Standard Time on multiple different platforms, including pretty much not every, but a bunch of different audio platforms, including Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcasts, and many others. You could also listen to it on our YouTube channel, which is called WABAN. There's a link in the description to that YouTube channel. We have the podcast there and also some gaming videos we did. Eventually, we might do more gaming videos. It's just, very busy time for us, so we haven't been able to. And then we also you could subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is called Nim TV. That's NIM TV. There's a link in the description to that as well. Go check it out. I talk about movies and TV shows and mostly movies, but I have done videos about TV shows. So yeah, that's kind of what I do, but more refined videos, shorter, not like than the podcast where it's like sometimes scripted. I don't want to say more refined because that makes it sound like it's better. And, no, it's not better than the podcast. It's just me. There you go. It's just me talking. That's the difference between that and the podcast. And they're shorter and maybe more specific topics.
She kind of plans them out a bit more.
Right. Sometimes, but yeah, so definitely check out that. Anyways, that's about all. So next week, I almost forgot to mention what we're doing next week. Next week, we are talking about the final season of Justice League Unlimited, which is also the final season of the entirety of the DC animated universe. Very exciting. We already did, if you look back, we already did all of Justice League, the 2 seasons of Justice League, and the first 2 seasons of Justice League Unlimited. So 1 season left. Very excited. We'll finally be done with DC for a while. We'll probably be. We've done a lot of DC content recently, so on this podcast. So we might take a long break from DC. Not that we don't like DC, but we've done a lot of DC. I'm a little bit DC'd out. At least talking about it on the podcast. I'll still probably watch. I plan on watching all of the DC animated universe shows besides the Justice League on my own. Outside of the podcast, but
of course you do.
I've actually been watching Batman recently, so it's been pretty good. Which is the original show in the series, for those of you who don't know. But anyways, yeah, that'll be next week. Very excited for that. Thanks everyone for listening to this week's episode of WABAN. I've been Nim,
and I'm Cub.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.